Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire with everything the world could offer, was about to discover a truth that would shatter his perfect life. At 56, he was the embodiment of wealth and power, a man who appeared untouchable. But beneath the polished exterior lay an ache, a void he couldn't explain, an emptiness wealth couldn't fill. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, let's get started. In his sprawling Malibu estate, surrounded by art and opulence, Ethan often found himself consumed by a single question. What's the point of all this if I have no one to share it with? He had no wife, no children, no meaningful ties to anchor his life. While the world saw him as a hero of philanthropy, he often felt like a prisoner of his own success, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. What Ethan didn't know was that a chance encounter on the bustling streets of San Francisco would change everything forever. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan stepped out of a high-stakes meeting in downtown San Francisco. The weight of yet another multi-million-dollar deal hung over him, but today, it felt hollow. Needing air, he took to the bustling streets, blending into the throngs of people rushing past. As he walked, his thoughts drifted to his unshakable loneliness, a constant companion despite his towering achievements. Suddenly, his eyes caught a young man slumped on the sidewalk. The cardboard sign beside him read, "Hungry, homeless, hoping for a chance." The man, no older than 18, was thin and weary, his tattered clothes barely shielding him from the cool breeze. But what made Ethan stop wasn't just the sight of another homeless youth in a city teeming with inequality. It was the boy's face. Piercing blue eyes stared back at him, mirroring his own. The sharp jawline, the slight cleft in the chin. It was as if Ethan were looking at a younger, darker version of himself. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. The world around him blurred as a strange connection took hold. The young man raised his head, his voice soft but edged with suspicion. "What? You've never seen a black kid down on his luck before?" The words stung, not because of their bluntness, but because Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this boy wasn't just a stranger. Ethan hesitated before crouching slightly to meet the young man's gaze. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't mean to stare." The boy straightened, his expression hardening. "Yeah, well, people stare all the time. Doesn't change anything." Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He had seen countless homeless people during his walks, but this was different. Something about this boy stirred a deep unease within him. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "James," the boy replied, his tone guarded. "James Parker." Ethan nodded slowly, repeating the name as if trying to place it. "How long have you been out here, James?" James shrugged. "A few months, I guess. Been bouncing around, trying to find work. But no one wants to hire some black kid with no address, no connections." His voice dropped, laced with frustration. "They'd rather just pretend I don't exist." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He couldn't ignore the weight of James's reality. Homelessness was a crisis Ethan had donated millions to combat, yet here was a young man whose life seemed untouched by those efforts. "Where's your family?" Ethan pressed gently. James's expression darkened. "My mom passed away last year. She was all I had." Ethan's throat tightened. For a moment, he was at a loss for words. He wanted to say something comforting, but everything felt inadequate. How could he, a man who had never wanted for anything, possibly relate to this boy's pain? As the silence stretched between them, James leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "So what? You gonna toss me $1 and feel good about yourself?" Ethan shook his head. "No," he said quietly. I think I can do more than that." Ethan stood there, conflicted. The logical side of him urged caution. After all, James was a stranger. But the boy's weary eyes and defiant tone revealed layers of pain Ethan couldn't ignore. He knew what it felt like to wear a mask, to hide vulnerability behind a wall of pride. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Ethan asked softly. James hesitated, his guard visibly rising. "I'll figure it out," he muttered, I always do. The casual dismissal struck Ethan as anything but. He couldn't shake the image of this young man, alone on the cold streets, while his own penthouse sat empty, drenched in luxury. The weight of his privilege felt unbearable. You don't have to, Ethan said suddenly. Come with me. Just for tonight. I can offer you a warm meal, a bed, and a chance to rest. James's eyes narrowed in suspicion. Why? What's in it for you? Ethan met his gaze steadily. Nothing. I want to help. For what felt like an eternity, James studied him, the wheels in his mind visibly turning. Ethan could sense the internal battle. Trust didn't come easily to someone who had lived through constant rejection. Finally, James exhaled sharply. Fine, he said, his voice tinged with skepticism. But just tonight. Relief washed over Ethan as he signaled for a taxi. During the silent ride to his penthouse, he couldn't help but notice James fidgeting, his eyes darting around nervously. When they arrived, James stepped inside, and his breath hitched. Wait, you live here? He asked, awestruck by the sheer opulence. Ethan nodded, feeling a flicker of discomfort. Yes, I do. The following days passed in a blur for Ethan. He arranged for James to stay at a modest but comfortable hotel, ensuring the young man had enough money for meals and essentials. Yet, despite Ethan's efforts, James's guarded demeanor remained unchanged. I'm not some project for you to fix, James said sharply one morning. I've been taking care of myself for years. I don't need handouts. Ethan nodded, sensing the pride behind James's words. It's not about charity, he replied carefully. It's about giving you a break, something everyone deserves. While James reluctantly accepted Ethan's help, Ethan found himself increasingly drawn to the boy's resilience and sharp mind. But the nagging sense of familiarity between them grew stronger, almost unbearable. On the third evening, Ethan invited James back to his penthouse for dinner. As they sat in the cavernous dining room, James couldn't help but stare at the space around him. You really live like this? He asked, his tone caught between amazement and disbelief. Ethan smiled faintly, stirring his untouched drink. It's just a house, he said, though even he didn't believe his own words. The meal passed in awkward silence until Ethan finally mustered the courage to speak. James, he began, his voice steady but unsure. Have you ever thought about taking a DNA test? James frowned, setting his fork down. What kind of question is that? Ethan hesitated, then said, I think we might be related. The room grew impossibly still. James stared at Ethan, his expression a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. What are you saying? That you think you're my uncle or something? No, Ethan replied, his voice softer now. I think I might be your father. James blinked, the weight of the words hitting him like a wave. You're joking, he said flatly, though his voice betrayed a tremor of uncertainty. Ethan shook his head. There was someone, a long time ago. We lost touch. I didn't know. I never thought. James leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly. You didn't think to check? Or did you just not care? The accusation cut through Ethan's defenses, leaving him exposed. If I had known, I swear. But you didn't. James interrupted, his voice rising. You didn't know because you didn't bother. People like me don't even cross your mind, do they? The words stung, but Ethan refused to retreat. That's why I need to know now. Please, he said quietly. Take the test. James stared at him for a long moment before exhaling deeply. Fine, he said, his voice hollow. But don't expect anything from me. The DNA test results arrived faster than Ethan expected, though each passing hour had felt like an eternity. Sitting in his study, the envelope lay unopened on the polished desk, its presence heavy with anticipation and dread. Finally, he tore it open, his hands trembling. The words were clear, definitive. James Parker was his biological son. Ethan stared at the paper, his breath catching as waves of guilt, regret, and disbelief washed over him. How had he missed this? A son, his son, had grown up facing struggles Ethan couldn't fathom while he had been consumed by board meetings and charity galas. The realization hit him like a blow. All his wealth and influence had done nothing to protect the boy who should have been his responsibility. That evening, Ethan invited James back to the penthouse. James arrived, his expression guarded as always. Ethan wasted no time, holding up the results. "I got the test back," he said, his voice low. "It's true. You're my son." James froze, his jaw tightening. For a moment he said nothing, his eyes flicking to the paper in Ethan's hand. "You're serious?" "Yes," Ethan replied, his tone filled with regret. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. If I had." "You didn't know because you didn't care to look." James cut him off, his voice sharp and unwavering. "You had your perfect little life, and people like me? We don't matter in your world." Ethan flinched at the accusation, but he didn't argue. "You're right," he admitted. "I failed you. I failed your mother. But I want to make it right. I want to be there now, however I can." James let out a bitter laugh. "You think money is going to fix this? You think you can just show up now and everything will be okay?" "No," Ethan said softly. "I don't expect that. But I'm asking for a chance to try." For the first time, James looked genuinely torn. The anger in his eyes wavered, replaced by something softer, pain, perhaps hope. "I don't know," he muttered, shaking his head. "I don't know if I can forgive you." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "Take your time," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." James perched uncomfortably on the edge of Ethan's luxurious leather couch, his arms folded tightly across his chest. Every inch of his posture screamed resistance, his body a fortress against the raw emotions bubbling beneath the surface. Ethan sat across from him, the space between them vast yet suffocating, his usually commanding presence dimmed by uncertainty. "You keep saying you didn't know," James began, his voice low but laced with a sharp edge. "But how could you not? You didn't think to check? Not once?" Ethan took a slow breath, steadying himself. "James, I didn't even know your mother." "Don't," James snapped, cutting him off. His gaze burned with frustration. "Don't make excuses. She worked herself to the bone, you know? 2 jobs. 3 when things got bad. Also I could eat, go to school. And where were you? On your private jet? At some 5-star resort?" Ethan's stomach twisted. The truth in James's words was undeniable, and it crushed him. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't there, and I should have been." James shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. "Should have, could have. But you weren't. And now you think showing up with your money is going to change anything? That it's going to make me forget what it's like to grow up without enough to eat?" "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "I don't think money will fix this. It won't fix anything, and I know that. But I want to try, James. I want to be here. Now for whatever you need." James's eyes narrowed, scanning Ethan's face as if searching for cracks in his resolve. "Why now?" he asked, his voice a mixture of anger and suspicion. "Because you feel guilty? Or because it's good PR for a billionaire to reconnect with his long-lost son?" The accusation stung, but Ethan refused to look away. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied. "Because I don't want to fail you again." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Ethan watched as James's gaze dropped to the floor, his fingers fidgeting against the seams of his worn jeans. The walls of anger surrounding him seemed to waver, just for a moment. "You think this is easy for me?" James muttered, his voice quieter now. "You show up out of nowhere, and I'm just supposed to, what? Trust you? Pretend the last 18 years didn't happen?" "No," Ethan said softly. "I don't expect that. Trust takes time, and I'm willing to earn it, no matter how long it takes." James's jaw tightened, and he exhaled sharply. "I don't even know who you are," he said, shaking his head. "And you don't know me." "You're right." Ethan admitted, leaning forward slightly. But I want to. I want to know you, James. I want to know everything, what you've been through, what you want for your future. Let me in, even if just a little. James looked up at Ethan, his expression torn between anger and something softer, hesitation, perhaps. I don't know if I can, he said finally. I don't know if I want to. Ethan nodded, his own eyes glistening. I understand. And I won't push you. But I'm not going anywhere, James. Whether it takes weeks, months, or years, I'll be here. The words hung in the air like a fragile promise, one that neither seemed ready to believe fully. James stood abruptly, his posture still tense. I need time, he said flatly, moving toward the door. Take all the time you need, Ethan replied, his voice soft but steady. Just as James reached the door, Ethan spoke again. James, he called, his voice breaking slightly. The young man paused but didn't turn around. I'm proud of you, Ethan said, his tone full of emotion. For surviving. For fighting through everything life threw at you. You didn't deserve what happened, but you're still standing. That takes strength. James's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might say something. But instead, he simply nodded once before walking out. The door clicked shut, leaving Ethan alone in the quiet, his heart heavy with regret but flickering with a faint glimmer of hope. The days that followed were tentative and quiet. James didn't call, and Ethan respected his need for space. But true to his word, Ethan didn't give up. Every morning, he sent a simple text. I'm here if you need me. A week later, James finally replied, Can we talk? They met at a small park outside the bustling city, a neutral ground far removed from Ethan's opulence and James's harsh reality. Ethan arrived early, nervously watching as James approached, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. You kept texting, James said flatly as he sat down. Ethan nodded. I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere. James sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I don't know what you want from me. I don't want anything, Ethan said carefully. But I do want to know you. What you've been through. What you want for your future. James glanced at him, skepticism still etched in his features. My future? He repeated. I've spent most of my life just trying to survive. I don't even know what I want anymore. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. Then maybe we can figure it out together, he offered. James didn't respond immediately, but he didn't shut down either. Instead, he began sharing pieces of his story, growing up with a mother who worked tirelessly, the nights he spent hungry, the way the world seemed to close its doors to him at every turn. For the first time, Ethan listened without interruption. He didn't try to fix or rationalize. He simply absorbed James's pain, the weight of it settling over him like a heavy coat. I didn't just survive, James said eventually, his voice tinged with defiance. I fought for everything. And I'm not looking for handouts now. I know, Ethan said softly. And I admire that about you. You're stronger than I ever was. The conversation began to shift, the tension between them easing as they found common ground. Ethan shared stories of his own struggles, not with survival, but with loneliness, with the burden of building a life that looked perfect but felt empty. I thought success would fill the void, Ethan admitted. But all it did was make me feel more alone. James nodded slowly, his guard lowering just enough to let Ethan in. Maybe we both messed up in our own ways, he said. But I guess that doesn't mean we can't try to do better now. Ethan smiled faintly. I'd like that. By the end of their conversation, something had shifted. It wasn't perfect, and trust was still a fragile thing. But for the first time, they were moving forward, not as strangers, but as two people trying to build something meaningful together. As the city lights shimmered in the distance, Ethan and James stood side by side, each lost in thought but united in purpose. Their journey was far from over, and the scars of the past wouldn't heal overnight. Yet in that moment, hope flickered, a small but steady flame. Sometimes, finding family isn't about perfection. It's about persistence, forgiveness, and a willingness to try. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales that remind us of the power of connection, compassion, and second chances.